All right, guys, Murph's here, and today I want to discuss firearm safety features. Now, this is not firearm safeties, this is the different mechanical features that are employed in firearms in order to be able to render them in a safe condition whenever it is that they're not actively being employed. Now, safeties on firearms are kind of a hot button topic within the Second Amendment community, and we'll kind of get into some of the nitty gritty on opinions and conclusions here at the end. However, what you will frequently run into are a lot of people espousing the values of some sort of manual safety or discussing whether or not your firearm needs to have a safety. You'll find new shooters who will come in and say, well, I want to make sure that I have a gun with a safety, da 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 da. First off, to kind of focus this video, I do want to address the fact that we're primarily going to be talking about handguns. We might reference rifles a couple of times, but it's been a pretty foregone conclusion since the turn into the 20th century that rifles have safeties on them. There were a couple of transitional items that made it from the 1800s into the 1900s without safeties, but for the most part, rifles have safeties, and no one really discusses that except in a few small cases that we might get into if I remember before this is all said and done. We're going to primarily focus on handguns and self-defense type applications because that's what a lot of people really dwell upon. More people shoot handguns, it seems, than rifles, especially of the tactical variety, but that's kind of a whole separate topic for another time. One of the things that I want to point out, and this is kind of like an overarching ideal on the channel and something to keep in mind in the discussion moving forward, is that ultimately safety is not derived from a feature as much as it is derived from from good firearms handling practices and all that kind of stuff. There are things that could help one way or the other, and we'll discuss those more fully as we go. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what type of safety you put on a firearm. If your practices are not sound and safe to begin with, you're not going to change that with a feature. To further get into this conversation, we need to go ahead and identify some terms that we're going to be using moving forward. Starting off with types of safeties, and we break this down into two categories. We have external safeties, and then we have passive safeties. External safeties are some sort of switch, lever, button, something along those lines, something that has to be manually defeated in order to be able to employ the firearm. We see this in a couple of different ways, and it kind of breaks down into two categories within this category, and that being frame-mounted safeties, like we see on this Browning High Power Mark III. As you can see here, we have a thumb type safety attached to the frame, as well as slide-mounted safeties, like we see on this Browning BDA 380, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. We can see here our safety is located on the slide itself. Both of these safeties can be found in an ambidextrous type setup. Most often, your slide-mounted safeties are also decockers, but you can have frame-mounted decockers as well. A decocker, it lowers the hammer from a cocked position to a decocked position without accidentally discharging the firearm. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind with decockers is that you could run into a situation where a failure could cause the gun to go off. On modern decockers, this safety actually rotates the firing pin out of alignment, so that shouldn't be an issue. But as my hunter safety instructor told me many years ago, mechanical safeties are mechanical devices that can fail. So general safe firearms practices still apply, keeping the weapon pointed in a safe direction, all that kind of stuff. Don't point it at anything that you're not willing to kill, blah, 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 blah. So something to keep in mind with those. For the most part, it shouldn't be too big of an issue on modern decockers. That pretty much covers your external safeties. Now let's go ahead and talk about passive safeties. Passive safeties are safeties that you defeat in the process of employing the firearm. They don't take a whole separate action in order to be able to deactivate and employ the gun. So you could see this in the form of magazine safeties, grip safeties, trigger safeties, and then also firing pin blocks. There are other types of internal safeties that are more passive type setups to preclude the possibility of the firearm going off should it be dropped or something along those lines. Quite frequently, passive safeties will be used in conjunction with active safeties or with your external safeties. So you have things like magazine disconnects, which you will find in this BDA 380. As you can see here, I've removed the magazine, the gun does not go off. Same type of deal with this Browning High Power Mark III, does not go off. However, if I reach up here, I can deactivate that safety and cause the gun to go off when I pull the trigger. But when it is not employed, the trigger is disconnected from the hammer. Grip safeties are commonly associated with the 1911. However, it is not the only firearm that uses a grip safety. And this safety gets deactivated by building my firing grip. This is actually something that used to be frequently requested by the cavalry. It's also used in conjunction with a thumb safety while we're at it. You also have your transfer bar safeties. Now, what is a transfer bar safety? This is something that's commonly associated with revolvers. However, there are echoes of that same design being utilized in semi-automatic pistols as well. In the 1800s, things like your Colt single action army did not necessarily have any type of hammer safety. So when you lowered the hammer and walked around with it, the firing pin actually extended into the chamber. We can see this on this standard manufacturing regulator, which I've removed the cylinder on so that we can see the firing pin protruding into the frame there. So if I had the cylinder on it and I had a live round in that chamber, the firing pin would potentially be coming into contact. I'm not sure if you guys can see, I'll roll in a picture if I need to. Would be coming into contact with that primer. Now, at rest, it would not necessarily be able to set off that primer, but if there were to be some sort of force imparted onto that hammer, a drop, a strong strike, or something along those lines, that could be enough transfer of energy to be able to impinge that primer and cause the gun to go off. So frequently, people who were carrying Colt single action armies would leave that chamber empty and have 5 rounds, something referred to as cowboy loading. Today's revolvers have a transfer bar safety which does not necessarily allow the firing pin to be in alignment with a primer up until the final movement of the trigger. That's also something that you see in some semi-automatic handguns like this SIG M11A1. This has no type of external safety. However, the hammer is not capable of striking the firing pin up until the final movement of the trigger. And you also see this in like Beretta Model 92s as well. In addition to that, a lot of times when you use decockers, when your hammer is lowered, as you can see here, hammer is cocked back right now. When I lower it, this actually has a rebounding hammer, which is not uncommon in revolvers as well. So this hammer is not presently resting against the firing pin, but when I pull the trigger, it makes contact and then rebounds back out of position. Another type of passive safety system. Now, of course, with this discussion, we have to get into striker-fired guns and Glocks specifically, because a lot of striker-fired guns utilize a lot of different passive safeties. This being a Glock 41 here. Right off the bat, we have what is referred to as the trigger dingus set into the face of the trigger, and this actually keeps the gun from going off if you don't actively apply good even pressure to the front of the trigger and deactivate the dingus. So if I press on the sides here, the trigger is unable to fall. But if I get on top of that protrusion, I'm now able to drop the striker. This is not just a trigger safety in that you have to properly engage with the trigger. This is also a drop safety. This is something that SIG has been running into with the P320 by not having any type of dingus or a mid-articulating trigger like you would see on a Smith & Wesson or an FN or something along those lines. By not having anything that freezes the trigger when the gun is dropped in a certain orientation, momentum allows that trigger to overcome its stationary position and discharge the firearm. Kind of one of those, Newtonian physics things, bodies in motion tend to want to stay in motion. That trigger's on its own hinge, so when it suddenly and rapidly decelerates, it wants to overcome its resistance. Now, in addition to that, Glocks have 2 other passive safeties that are utilized in order to help make the gun more drop safe and also keep the striker from being able to leap forward and all that kind of stuff. So there are 3 different passive safeties incorporated into a Glock. You'll also find passive safeties in 1911. The Series 80 1911 is more drop safe than a Series 70 because of how the firing pin was redesigned. There's a safety in there that gets deactivated with the movement of the trigger, kind of like with the transfer bar safeties and all that kind of stuff, but not exactly the same. This is to make the gun more drop safe. However, Series 80 triggers have a tendency to be a little more stiff or mushy than your Series 70 triggers, so a lot of people want to pursue those over the Series 80 from a engagement standpoint, not so much from a safety standpoint. All right, so those are different type of safeties and the subcategories within. What are the pros of an external safety? The primary positive of an external safety is being able to positively identify whether or not your firearm or your, say, subordinate's firearm is unsafe. And utilizing the term subordinate is very important in this case because frequently police departments and the military will require that their handguns have safeties on them. And this is one of those things to be able to check against the possibility of someone doing something silly, because a lot of those organizations employ a wide variety of people with a wide variety of firearms experience, and not all of it necessarily positive, as well as even somebody who has a lot of experience can make a mistake, can become overly confident and do unsafe practices because it's never bit them before. So they will utilize safeties to be able to preclude those possibilities. The other side of that pro is if you're somebody who's maybe kind of new to firearms, you might preference a gun with a safety on it because it gives you some added confidence in your ability to handle the firearm safely, as well as defeat the possibility of maybe small hands getting a hold of it and behaving unsafely with that gun. If you have small children running about, they potentially get a hold of your handgun. They don't know how to operate a gun. They don't know how to defeat a safety. It's less likely that they will harm themselves or others. However, I would really point out in that is kind of using a safety as a crutch, and safe firearms storage is far more important than having a safety on your gun in order to preclude small children or even big children from hurting themselves. So I would not use that as some sort of crutch for why what you're doing is acceptable, as much as if you feel more confident having a gun with a safety on it, that's personal preference, and I can't really fault you for that. That is your comfort level, and you have to be very critical in assessing your comfort level. Well, what are some of the advantages of passive safeties? Well, one of the great things about passive safeties is you don't really have to think about deactivating anything. You're not potentially going to run into a situation where you thought you turned off the safety, or perhaps your safety got bumped on or something like that, and now you pull the gun out and you get a click no bang, or you get a dead trigger, whatever it is that it may be. You just draw and go, and that's very fluid, that's very simple to think about and all that kind of stuff. There's no additional steps to be missed, no additional complication in handling your firearm and all those types of things. That simplicity is something that, you know, especially if you're stressed and all that kind of stuff, really can't be, it's never going to be overrated. Simplicity is never overrated in this case. And keeping in mind that passive safeties are still just as effective as external safeties. They work in the same manner. What are some of the cons of external safeties? Well, one of the biggest issues you're going to run into, in my opinion, with external safeties is actually working around them. And this is a very subjective thing. So guys, I train with all of the handguns that I have shown you. So that means that I train with active safeties and I train with passive safeties. And one of the biggest things that I have found is that you have to make sure if you're carrying guns with active safeties, you need to train around them. And you also need to pick guns that actually work with your hand. So in the case of frame-mounted safeties like these thumb safeties and stuff like that on my 1911, my high-power Mark III, these are very easy to get a hold of. I can ride them and make sure that they don't get bumped on or anything like that whenever it is that I'm engaging with them. There's no possibility that I'm going to miss employing these. However, if you get into slide-mounted safeties, like on this BDA 380, you need to have some pretty long thumbs to be able to activate those safeties. Not so much on this. This is a pretty small gun, but if you're talking about like a Beretta Model 92, which already has like really fat grips on it, if you've got smaller hands or short fingers or something along those lines, it could be very difficult to be able to get enough of your thumb on that safety to be able to positively deactivate it. Well, why is it so important to positively deactivate the safeties, especially on like a double action gun, which is inherently more safe? Why don't I just leave the safety up? And that is something that I would massively argue against. Just leaving your safety off. Not because like, oh, all of a sudden the gun's more unsafe, but more so to preclude the possibility of your safety accidentally being engaged. So at one time I carried an M9, and I actually went through like a master marksmanship course which involved training for the M9 as well. And one of the immediate actions that we were taught while clearing a malfunction on the M9 was check the safety. Because it being a slide mounted safety, if you were, say, doing slide rack reloads, or perhaps it just cleared a malfunction or something like that, you could accidentally engage the safety in the process of manipulating that slide. And that would deactivate your trigger at that point, would not allow you to engage. That's kind of problematic. And that's something that's not going to be solved by tap, rack, bang. So you might start tap, but then also check your safety as you go into rack so that you can just go, oh, never mind, disengage the safety and get back to your engagement. You don't want that kind of stutter step if you're fighting. Anything that's keeping you from putting rounds down range is negative in this context. It's the same kind of thing with, like, currently I carry an M17, and I know a lot of guys who do not engage the thumb safety on an M17 because the M17 still has the passive safeties that you find on the P320, but I have two issues with that. One, the P320 passive safeties are not working, and two, if that safety got engaged by accident, that would be an unnecessary stutter step at that point. Now, when it also comes to interfacing with some safeties, I've come across some very stiff safeties. For a long time, I had a Smith & Wesson M&P Shield that the safety was very low profile and kind of difficult to get a thumb on, as well as very stiff to actuate. I was not a big fan of that safety. I didn't like its positioning. I liked that it was low profile and that it made it comfortable for carry, but if it's not large enough of a profile to be able to accurately or consistently engage with in order to be able to defeat it, it's really not that helpful at that point. And those are some of the things that I take into account whenever it is that I'm evaluating firearms with safeties, and I would highly implore you to do the same. So in my opinion, if you have a safety, you need to train around utilizing that safety. Well, what about the cons of passive safeties? The number one con of passive safeties is that it really relies on safe firearm handling techniques. Now, previous statement, you don't get away from those at all. The problem with safe firearms handling techniques is that it puts a lot of onus on the individual to be able to employ those safe practices. And if they are not doing so on the regular, then that is potentially detrimental. I still don't think we derive additional safety just because we have an external safety, but I will admit that it is an additional step that has to be defeated or impacted in order to be able to employ the firearm effectively. And we don't really have that with pistols. Now, a fairly quick discussion on rifle safeties, and this long gun safeties in general. You will sometimes run across a term utilized in some circles of the lawyer safety, which is specific to lever action rifles. Lever action rifles have always been produced with a grip type safety. There's a small detent that protrudes from the grip of the stock that the lever interacts with. So if you're squeezing the lever, the firearm can be discharged. If you're not, the firearm cannot. And in the 1960s, lever action rifles and other types of fairly simple manually operated systems started to employ safeties. And a lot of times these are referred to as lawyer safeties because it just is perceived that lawyers got into it and made sure that those guns had safeties on them. Honestly, I think a lot of it has to do with those countries started exporting those guns to European markets, or were looking to try to expand their presence in the European markets, and a lot of those markets do prefer to have safeties on those firearms. So that's kind of how that came about. In general, that always struck me as some silly complaint. Oh, well, they added a safety to it. It doesn't need a safety. The half-cock position's a safety. Or, the grip safety is a safety. That's more than enough safety in this case. Well, honestly, I feel like that's a pretty silly overall concept. Now, other kind of outdated concepts, in my opinion, when it comes to safeties also include things like magazine safeties. So this never made sense to me. Why is this way? What if my magazine gets slightly bumped and now all of a sudden, with that tiny amount sticking out of the grip, you barely even see it, I can't utilize my firearm? At the very least, if I had one shot, that would be better off for me to be able to get into tap, rack, bang, and get back into the rest of what it is that's going on. This is also very problematic when you're at courses or at competitions or something like that. As I frequently compete with this Mark III, I have to explain to my RSO beforehand, like, okay, hey man, so it's got a magazine safety. How do you want to go about this? I can reach my finger up there and drop the hammer, or I can have an empty magazine, show you that it's empty, and then drop the hammer that way. Something to keep in mind when you're at competitions and stuff like that. When you show safe, and you'll see this in the military and probably police as well, when you show safe, you remove the source feed, lock the slide to the rear, you inspect the chamber, you have somebody else inspect the chamber, you release the slide, and then you drop the hammer. And that 100% makes sure that when you step off the line, as long as you don't change anything about the condition of your handgun, there's no round in the chamber. It gets to a little bit of a stutter step whenever you have something with a magazine disconnect. It's just one of those like quality of living type deals there. Some people, getting into a little bit further into outdated concepts, some people will deactivate the grip safeties on their 1911s and stuff like that so that they can build their grip however it is that they see fit. I would sooner see somebody preference a grip safety with a memory bump than deactivating the safety, because this is a drop safe feature that you should maybe not just wantonly deactivate. And that is illegal in some competitions as well. In my opinion, one of the biggest and most outdated concepts is that you need to have a heavy trigger in order to be able to have a safe gun, like a double action trigger or something along those lines. You see this discussion a lot with revolvers as well as double action semi-autos. Someone will tell you, well, it's got like a 10, 12 pound trigger, so that is going to make this gun inherently more safe. That way, somebody really has to want to pull that trigger in order to be able to set that gun off. Well, in reality, if somebody is stressed enough to have to pull their gun and start using it, they're going to beat that whatever pound trigger pull. And the greater issue becomes, how well are they managing that 10 to 12 pound trigger pull? Are they going to start throwing shots all over the place and turn their justified shoot into a homicide investigation? That's what I start to question at that point. In my own opinion, and this also comes back to dingus style trigger safeties, safety is not derived from your trigger, with a possible exception for the fact that like heavy triggers are going to be more difficult to overcome in a drop safe type situation. But if you're talking about employment, safety is not derived from your trigger. You kind of need to divorce that idea, because in a self-defense situation, if this gun comes out of the holster, we are fighting. I'm not using this to scare somebody off. This isn't how I'm going to de-escalate the situation. The presence of a firearm only escalates a situation unless you're dealing with someone who's unarmed. And you're not really in a self-defense situation if you're dealing with someone who's unarmed. That's like robbery or murder or something along those lines. You don't want to get involved with that. So if this gun comes out, there's really not a lot of talking left in order to de-escalate the situation. We are fighting now. And as my draw occurs and I get out to full extension, my expectation is that once I hit full extension, my sights are aligned and that gun's going off. That's my unlock code at that point. This gun doesn't come out until we're fighting. And once we're fighting, we are fighting. And I am fighting to win. And that's an important thing you have to keep in mind in these cases. Sitting there and being like, no, stop, da-da-da-da-da. You're not law enforcement. You don't have a requirement to arrest somebody or to take somebody in. You also don't necessarily have qualified immunity or anything along those lines either. So when you get into a fight, it needs to be something that a reasonable person would assess to be a fight, would assess to be self-defense. So this is not, hey man, I need you to calm down, and you pull a gun out. That wouldn't calm me down. That puts me quite on the opposite, actually. So it's an important concept to keep in mind overall. All right, so what are my opinions when it comes to external safeties versus passive safeties? Because clearly I have both of these things represented here today for this discussion. What do I recommend for people whenever it is that they tell me that they want to get a concealed carry, or they're looking at handguns for defensive purposes in general? What do I tell them? What I tell them ultimately is it comes down to their comfort level. Whatever makes them feel like they can safely operate around the handgun, that is okay. I will not tell you that passive is better than external safety. Some people tell you like, oh, well, external safety could slow you down. Well, yeah, if you're not training with it, absolutely it could. But if you are training around it, it will not be an issue. And you should be training with your carry gun anyway. If you're carrying a gun for self-defense, you better be training with it. So I don't tell somebody that they're an idiot for not having a gun with a safety, because ultimately every gun that I showed you here, all of these modern handguns have safeties on them. Every gun has a safety. The only question becomes what type of safety. And I'm not going to tell you one is better than the other. The only thing that I'll really tell you when it comes to carrying and safety is that it's pretty silly to not have a round in the chamber. But that's a discussion for a whole other day, because I know that's going to pop up somewhere in the comments section. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.